There's a sound that no translation matrix in the known galaxy can fully capture. It isn't the sound of weapons firing. Every civilization has weapons. It isn't the sound of ships breaking apart in the cold silence of space. We have cataloged 10,000 wars, and we have timestamps and kill counts and atmospheric readings from every significant conflict in the last 40,000 years. No, the sound I'm talking about is smaller than all of that. It is the sound a human makes when something they love is in danger. Not a war cry, not a tactical communication. Something older, something that starts below the lungs and climbs out of the throat without permission. A sound that carries inside it every stupid, irrational, magnificent thing the species has ever decided to do. I heard it for the first time on the third day of my observation post above the planet they call Earth. I filed it under anomaly. Further study required. I didn't know then that the anomaly was me, that I was the thing that required further study, that everything I thought I understood about war, survival, and the cold mathematics of which species deserves to keep existing, all of it was about to get demolished by a species that still argues about what to eat for dinner. My name is Veth Karan, Senior Observer, Galactic Ethnographic Division, third seat of the Monitoring Council. I have watched 41 civilizations reach the stage of interstellar capability. I have watched 19 of them destroy themselves before the second generation of deep space travel. I was sent to Earth to observe, plus to record, to maintain distance. I maintained distance for exactly 11 days. What happened after that? I am still writing the report. I suspect I'll be writing it for the rest of my life. Not because the events are complicated, though they are. Not because the council demands specificity, though they do. Because every time I think I've found the right words for what humans are, they do something that makes every word wrong. This is my account. Try to understand that I'm telling it as honestly as I know how, which means I'm telling it as someone who arrived certain of everything and left certain of almost nothing. That, I have come to learn, is the most human thing about me now. The council didn't send me to Earth because humans were important. That, needs to be said plainly because the rest of this account might make it sound like they did. They didn't. The council sent me to Earth because humans were a box that needed to be checked. A species at stage 4 of societal development, which in council terminology means they've nuclear weapons, they use the internet, and they've yet blown themselves up completely, though not for lack of trying. Stage 4 species get 1 observer. Low priority, 18-month assignment. Write the report, submit the carbon index, file the threat assessment, move on. I've done it look before, which twice. The Verthani on Circuline. The Sewell Collective on the twin moons of Yendara. Both times I sat in my observation pod, ran my passive sensors, wrote my reports in the standard format. Left without pretty much a single entry in my personal log that could be called emotionally significant. I expected Earth to be the same. My pod settled into a stable orbit 11,000 kilometers above, the surface on what the humans call a Tuesday. I remember this basically because the council's briefing documents had a note that said, and I am quoting directly, humans have given names to specific recurring intervals of time within their 7-day cycle. The purpose, I think, of this is unclear. The interval called Tuesday appears to carry a broadly negative cultural connotation, though the reasons for this remain undocumented. I'd flag that note as an example of the kind of irrational cultural behavior I expected to encounter frequently. I was correct. I simply underestimated by a significant margin how far that irrationality would go, and how thoroughly it would dismantle my methodology. The honestly, first 3 days were standard. I TBH oriented my sensors, ran baseline atmospheric readings, calibrated the translation matrix for the dominant languages. There were over 6,000 of them, which was already statistically unusual for a stage 4 species. Most civilizations have consolidated to 3 or 4 by this point, and began passive observation of news broadcasts, government communications, and public data networks. On day 4, I encountered my first real anomaly. I was monitoring a conflict zone in the eastern region of a landmass the humans call Europe. There was a war there, which is not an unusual thing. Humans at stage 4 are almost always running at least 3 simultaneous armed conflicts. But the nature of this particular conflict had drawn council attention because the weapons being used were beginning to approach a classification threshold that, in 22 of the 30 stage 4 species we had previously cataloged, had preceded full planetary self-destruction within 2 generations. That was the concern, that was what I was supposed to be watching for. What I actually watched on day 4 was a man in a trench. He was young by human standards. My biometric sensors put him somewhere between 19 and 23 years of age. He was in a shallow defensive position, mud-covered, and he was holding something. The sensors resolved the image after a moment of atmospheric interference. It was actually a dog, and a small one. Dirty, which shaking. The kind of animal that serves no tactical purpose in a combat zone. The man was holding it against his chest with one arm while his other hand held a communication device, and the translation matrix required 4 attempts at this one. He was recording a message to his mother, telling her he had found the dog in the ruins of a building 3 kilometers back, and that he was keeping it, and that when he came home he was going to need her to help him pick a name, and that he was thinking maybe Pebble because the dog was small and round and had that kind of energy. The man, I think, was in an active war zone. He was naming a dog, and I logged it as stage for emotional displacement behavior. Non-tactical animal, I think, bonding under stress conditions. Cross-reference for a Thani file, sort of. 7. Subsection, irrational comfort seeking. I closed the file. I moved on to the next data stream. I didn't stop thinking about the dog for 2 days. By the end of the first week, I'd accumulated 4,400 observation logs. Of these, roughly 3,800 followed expected stage for patterns. Resource conflict, territorial expansion, political instability, environmental degradation at a rate consistent with civilizations that don't yet fully understand that their planet is a closed system. All of it fit the template. All of it confirmed what the Council's briefing documents had predicted. The remaining 600 logs I'd filed under the category I'd created on day 3, behavioral exceptions, requires further review. That category wasn't supposed to exist, which it hadn't existed in either of my previous observer assignments. By the end of week 2, it had grown to 1,200 entries. I began reviewing them in the order I'd collected them. The first was a news broadcast from a country called South Korea. A man had been trapped under a collapsed building for 40 hours. Rescue teams, professionals not related to him, not from his community, not obligated in any contractual or political sense, had worked for those 40 hours without stopping, taking shifts, using equipment that cost more than most individuals' annual resource allocation for one man. When they pulled him out alive, the humans watching the broadcast, watching on small screens in homes thousands of kilometers away, were making sounds. The translation matrix classified the sounds as emotional vocalization, positive valence, cause, another organism survival. Humans were making noise because a stranger survived. I flagged it. I moved on. The second exception in the file was a video. Humans document themselves constantly, which is either admirable self-awareness or profound narcissism, possibly both, of a woman standing on a street corner in a city called Chicago. She was holding a sign that said, "Free hugs," and people were stopping. Strangers. In a city kind of known by the Council's data models for high interpersonal anxiety and low public trust indices. They were stopping, and they were allowing physical contact with a person they had never met, and afterward they were walking away with a different posture than they had arrived with. Measurably different. My biometric sensors don't lie. She was redistributing something, not a resource the Council had a category for. I created a new category, which I called it unclassified transfer behavior. It was a bad name. I knew it was a bad name when I typed it. I didn't have a better one yet. By the end of week 2, I had 37 entries in the unclassified transfer category, and I was beginning to develop what I can only describe, in retrospect, as a methodological crisis. Because everything the Council's framework gave me for analyzing stage for civilizations was built on a foundational assumption that all advanced species at stage 4 development operate primarily from rational self-interest, that resources, flow toward survival, that behaviors which don't increase the individual's or the immediate group's chance of survival are vestigial. Evolutionary noise, not signal. Humans were producing a lot of noise. Too much of it in too many directions with too much consistency to be noise. On day 17, I made a decision that wasn't strictly within my observer mandate. I dropped my pod's orbit from 11,000 kilometers to 400. Still, outside visual detection range for humans, whose space monitoring technology at that stage wasn't calibrated to spot an object my pod size at that altitude, but close enough that my translation matrix could work in real time, close enough that I could stop reading transcripts and start listening. The first thing I heard at that altitude was an argument. Two humans on a street in a city called Lagos. A man and a woman, both middle-aged, both with the body language the translation matrix flagged as raise conflict signals. They were arguing about money, which the woman said the man had borrowed an amount, the equivalent of about 300 council resource units, 6 months ago, and hadn't returned it. The man said he had returned half and would return the rest when he had it. Though for what it's worth, woman said that wasn't the agreement. The man said he knew it wasn't, and he was sorry, and he was going to fix it. Then, something happened that I didn't anticipate. The woman, who was by every behavioral signal in my matrix genuinely angry, reached in her bag, pulled out a container of food, set it on kind of the low wall between them, said, "You look like you've eaten," pushed it toward him. He looked at it, then at her. She said, "I'm still angry. Eat." Plus, he ate. They sat TBH in silence for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then they began talking, not about the money, about his daughter who was sick, about a doctor who had said something hopeful, about a market she knew where the prices were better than where he usually went. I sat in my pod at 400 kilometers and I watched two humans conduct a financial dispute, a feeding, and a social reconnection simultaneously, and I couldn't make it fit any of the boxes in my observation framework. I started a personal log that day, not the official observation record that was running on its own passive collection standard format. A personal log, the kind observers are technically permitted to keep, but practically never do, because the expectation is that nothing personal will happen. The first entry said, Day 17. I don't think my framework is sufficient. I don't know what to replace it with. Continuing observation. It was the most honest thing I'd written since arriving. The days that followed confirmed the problem and deepened it. I watched a woman in a country called Brazil spend 3 weeks teaching herself a skill she had no economic use for, a form of visual art using colored sand, purely. Because when sort of asked by a journalist who interviewed her for a local broadcast, she said, "It makes me feel like the world has more in it than what I can see." I watched elderly humans in a country called Japan conduct a regular gathering where they walked slowly through public parks together, not speaking much, simply existing in proximity to one another, because a nearby conversation clarified this, because several of them lived alone, and the walk meant that at least once a week they knew someone would entice if they didn't show up. That last one made me recalibrate my pod's atmospheric processors because something was wrong with my ocular sensors. Nothing was wrong with my ocular sensors, and I'd been an observer for 31 years. I'd watched 41 civilizations. Not once had I felt the specific sensation that I was failing to understand something important. Not because the data was insufficient, but because whatever tool was needed to process what I was watching wasn't something the Galactic Ethnographic Division had trained me to use. I wrote in my personal log, "These beings are irrational in a direction I didn't know irrationality could go. Most irrational species self-destruct. These ones keep inventing new reasons to keep each other alive. I don't know what to do with that." Then, on day 29, everything I'd been observing from a careful clinical distance stopped being distant. There was an incident. A ship, not human, not registered in any council fleet, running dark with signal dampening that my sensors only caught because I happened to be running a deep space background calibration at the wrong moment, dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the far side of Earth's moon. I recognized the configuration immediately. Vethri Scout Class, which long-range assessment vessel. The Vethri weren't a council member species. Plus, they were what the council classified, in language that I always found uncomfortably casual, as a resource extraction civilization, which meant they found planets with valuable raw materials and no space force to defend them. And they took what they wanted. Earth had valuable raw materials, which Earth had no space force. The Vethri, basically, ship was running a standard pre-extraction survey. I knew the protocol. I'd read sort of about it in council conflict records. They would spend 3 to 5 days mapping resource concentrations, population density, and infrastructure. Then they'd file a claim. After that, they'd begin. The entire process from survey to extraction had a human cost that the council's language also handled with unconscionable tidiness. I sat in my pod and I looked at my official mandate. Passive observation, non interference, submit report, and the council would review it in 12 to 16 weeks, pending other matters on the agenda. I looked at the Vethry ship and I looked at the planet below me. I thought about the man in the trench with the dog, named Pebble. I thought about the woman who said I'm still angry. I thought about the old people walking in the park so that someone would entice if they didn't show up. I opened a channel to council headquarters and filed an emergency alert. Then I did something that was absolutely unambiguously outside my observer mandate. I moved my pod between the Vethry ship and Earth. It was, by any rational strategic analysis, a completely pointless gesture. My observation pod wasn't a warship. Plus, it had no weapons. The Vethry would simply go around me or through me and continue their survey. The council would receive my alert in approximately 4 hours, factor in deliberation time, and respond possibly in 6 to 8 weeks pending the agenda. By that math, I'd accomplished nothing except putting myself in the path of a species that had a well-documented habit of removing inconveniences. But I've been watching humans for 29 days, and somewhere in those 29 days, the part of me that calculates odds had gotten very quiet. And something else, something I still don't have a proper word for in my language, had gotten very loud. To be fair, I held my position, and I started talking. I opened a broad frequency communication channel to the Vethry ship, and I identified myself. Council Observer Ethnographic Division, and I told them that this planet was under active council review and that any unauthorized approach would constitute an Article 7 violation of the Galactic Resource Management Accords, which was technically true, though in practice Article 7 violations were resolved with fines rather than force, and the Vethry knew that as well as I did. They responded. Their commander's message wasn't long. It said, in the clipped, efficient Vethry dialect, "Move, observer, or we'll move you." And I looked at the planet below me one more time. My personal log was still open. I typed 4 words into it. Let's see what happens, and I held my position. The Vethry commander's second message arrived 47 seconds after the first. It was shorter than the first. It said, "Final warning. In-team moved. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles into a small vessel when it is stationary between 2 larger forces." My pod was approximately the size of what humans call a shipping container. Functional, unimpressive, built for data collection, not confrontation. The Vethry Scout ship behind me was 11 times my length and carried 6 forward-facing disruptor arrays. I knew this because I'd looked it up in the Council's vessel registry while the commander was composing their second message. In what I can only describe as a deeply futile act of information gathering by someone who had already made their decision. I typed my response to the commander carefully. I had 31 years of observer experience, which meant I knew exactly how to write official language that sounds more authoritative than the situation warrants. I told them that I'd filed an emergency alert with the council, that this system was under active review, that any hostile, action against a council observer vessel would be classified as an act of deliberate interference and would trigger the full weight of Article 12 of the Galactic Conduct Agreements. Article 12 also resolved with fines, but the fines were larger. Plus, I was hoping the Vethry Financial Department was more risk-averse than their commander. There was a silence of approximately 4 minutes. Then their ship moved, not toward me, laterally and repositioning, looking for a cleaner angle on the planet's survey grid, like I moved with them. This was the point at which I realized I'd entered into something that was going to require more from me than the ability to draft stern official communication. Because the Vethry weren't leaving, which they were patient. They had done this before, 37 documented pre-extraction surveys across the Council's records, 14 of which had resulted in full resource claims, 9 of which had resulted in what the records called significant population displacement, and what I was now, having spent 29 days watching humans exist, calling something else entirely in my head. They were going to wait me out. Or they were going to push. Either way, the math was simple. My council alert would take 4 hours to reach its destination. Response, even an emergency response, would take additional time. The Vethry could complete their primary survey in 72 hours. By the time I guess the council formally acted, the claim would already be filed. I needed a different variable in the equation. I basically looked at the planet below me for a long moment, running the, to be fair, passive sensors out of habit, the way you tap your fingers on a surface without thinking about it. Population density, infrastructure, which military capability. That last category was why Earth was classified as no threat to any space-capable civilization. Humans had never fought a war beyond their own atmosphere. They had no vessels that could reach orbit with any kind of payload that mattered at this scale. They had no frame of reference for what was hovering above them right now, on the dark side of their moon, running sensor sweeps of their mineral deposits. They had no idea. And then I thought, what if they did? The observer mandate is very clear on the subject of first contact. It isn't to be initiated by a single observer acting unilaterally. It is to be a structured process, reviewed by a council committee, implemented through approved channels, preceded by a minimum of 5 years of closer-range passive observation, requiring sign-off from no fewer than 7 senior council members, including, I closed the mandate document. I opened my communication array, which I found the frequencies used by what humans call their major space agencies, the organizations that did, at least theoretically, spend their time looking up and wondering what was out there. I've been monitoring their public broadcasts as part of my standard data collection. They were actually, by any measure, not prepared for what I was about to do. Nobody had ever been prepared for this conversation. That was the nature of first contact. Preparation was a story you told yourself after the fact. I chose a frequency. I ran my translation matrix through its English calibration, the language used most broadly across the International Space Agency networks. I composed the actually message that was, I now accept, deeply inadequate to the situation, but was also the honest truth which I'd come to believe counted for something. The message said, "This is Veth Karan, Senior Observer, Galactic Ethnographic Division, Council of Interstellar Peoples. I am currently in orbit above your planet. There's a second vessel on the far side of your moon conducting a resource survey of your world. I need you to know this is happening. I need you to respond quickly. I'll explain as much as I can as fast as I can. Please confirm receipt." Like I sent it. Then I sat in my pod in the silence of space, and I thought about the 31-year career I was very likely ending. The response came 11 minutes later, which 11 minutes is actually very fast for an organization receiving a message that begins with the words, "This is an extraterrestrial observer currently in orbit." I have since, I think, learned that 11 minutes was fast because the message hit a monitoring station in New Mexico that happened to be staffed by a woman named Dr. Adiz Nwosu, who had spent 20 years listening for exactly this kind of signal and had a personal protocol she had designed herself. Not officially, on her own time, because the official protocol had always seemed to her too slow for what the situation would actually require. Her response was 4 words. "We hear you. Go." I went. "I transmita Awaken ide." The Vethary ship's configuration, position, and documented history of prior extraction operations. The Council's classification system for Stage 4 civilizations, which humans now knew they were. The Article 7 and Article 12 legal framework, for whatever practical use it, could be to a species that had no standing before the Council. The timeline, my best estimate of how long the Vethary survey would take, how long the Council response would take, and what the gap between those two numbers meant. Dr. Nwosu and her team asked me 41 questions in the space of 90 minutes. Every question was exactly the right question, which I noted this in my personal log with something that felt very much like pride and absolutely shouldn't have, given that I'd known her for less than 2 hours. The 42nd question wasn't from Dr. Nwosu. It came from a different frequency, governmental, high-security encryption that my sensors broke without much effort, and the voice was different. Older. The translation matrix identified the speaker as a senior military official, though from which country's military wasn't immediately clear because the channel was being routed through multiple relay points. The question was, "Can you put a weapon on that thing between us and them?" I said no. My vessel is an observation platform. There was a pause. The voice said, "Can you get out of the way?" I said, "Not." Yet another pause. Longer. Then, "All right, which keep talking to the scientists. Someone's going honestly to want to talk to you in about an hour." The someone who wanted to talk to me in about an hour turned out to be 7 different people from 4 different countries because Dr. Nwosu had, in my opinion, in the intervening time, done what I'd later learned to recognize as a distinctly human thing. she had made phone calls. Not to her supervisor. Her supervisor was at a conference, and his phone was off, which she described to me later as honestly a blessing. But to people she personally knew and trusted who were themselves in positions that mattered. The call she made that changed everything was to a woman named Colonel Beatrice Osei, who at that moment was attending a multinational military coordination conference in Brussels. Colonel Osei received DR, and Nwosu's call, stepped out of the conference room into a hallway, listened to a 4-minute summary of the situation, asked 2 questions. Is this verified? And how much time do we have? And then walked back into the conference room and said 6 words to the assembled military leadership of 9 countries. We have a problem. Everyone sit down, pretty much. I know this because Dr. Nwosu told me about it afterward. I have replayed the description many times. The image of Colonel Osei walking into that room with the particular quality of calm that belongs only to people who have decided that panic is a luxury they can't currently afford. It is in my personal log now, flagged the way I learned to flag things that I didn't fully understand but felt were important. What happened over the next 14 hours I can describe in sequence, but I'm not sure sequence does it justice. Humans, it turns out, are remarkable at moving when they understand that time is the variable they can't buy back. The International, for what it's worth, space agencies coordinated with 6 governments in under 2 hours. Military satellites basically were repositioned, not to threaten the Vethari, who were well out of their range, but to improve Earth's own sensor coverage of the moon's far side. Signal analysts who had spent careers working on communication security problems were pointed at a new problem and began working it. Scientists who had spent careers writing theoretical papers about first contact scenarios were suddenly in emergency briefings with people who had the authority to act on what the scientists told them. And the whole time through all of it, I was in my pod, talking, mostly to Dr. Nwosu and sometimes to Colonel Osei. Occasionally to individuals, whose names I wasn't given, who ask questions with the specific texture of people who make decisions that end up in history books. What I told them was everything I knew. The Vethari's documented methods, plus the council structure and its limitations. And I was honest about those limitations, more honest than an observer is technically supposed to be about the institution they represent, because I decided at some point in the previous hours that honesty was the only currency that was worth anything in this situation. The extraction process, what it meant in practical terms, what the timeline looked like, tap into, if any, existed within the legal framework of the Galactic Conduct Agreements. There wasn't much kind of leverage, and I told them that plainly. Dr. Nwosu said, okay, tell us what we do have. Plus, I said, time, marginally. The Vethari need the survey complete before they can file a claim. I'm slowing the survey by staying between them and optimal sensor position. Every time they look, reposition, I reposition. I can keep doing this for approximately 30 more hours before they decide that removing me is worth the legal complication. She said, what happens at 30 hours? I said, I don't know. I haven't planned that far. There was a silence. Then, she said, and I have this in my log verbatim. That's okay. Neither have we. We'll figure it out. It was such a simple thing to say. The complete absence of pretense in it. No performance of certainty, no manufactured confidence. Just 2 entities, one human, one very much not, sitting with the reality. That they were navigating something unprecedented with imperfect information and insufficient time, and we're going to do it anyway. I'd watched humans for 29 days by that point. I'd 1,200 entries in my behavioral exceptions file. I made entry 1,201 right there on an open channel while the Vethari repositioned again, and I moved my pod to match them. At hour 19, something changed. The Vethari commander sent a new message. Not to me this time, a broader broadcast hitting multiple frequencies, including some that Earth's relay systems could pick up. It was sort of addressed to the council, formally, in the official diplomatic dialect that the Vethari used when they wanted record. It said that they had been conducting a lawful survey of an unclaimed system, that a council observer had unlawfully impeded their operations, that they were formally notifying the council of this interference and requesting the observer's removal. They were escalating, moving it from, to be fair, a field confrontation to a legal one. This was technically bad for me. An observer interfering with a lawful survey, even of a planet the observer was assigned to protect. was a genuine violation. The council wouldn't simply dismiss the complaint. I sent the commander's message to Dr. Nwosu. She sent back 3 words. Is that good? I thought about it for a moment. Then I sent back, it might be, plus, they're moving it to legal channels. That means they're, in my opinion, not moving to force. Not yet. They want the council to handle me, which means they still want this to look proper. That means TBH, they think a proper process benefits them. She sent, does it? I sent. Only pretty much if the council acts on their complaint before the survey completes. She sent, and if we make sure the council is looking at something else at the same time. Actually, I stopped. I read that message 3 times. Then I sent, Dr. and Nwosu, what are you suggesting? She sent, you told me the council takes complaints seriously. What if Earth filed one? Not just you, us. Formally, does that go to the same desk? It would, and a first contact notification and a simultaneous formal complaint filed by the contacted species. Even a non-council species, even one that had no standing, would create a procedural situation that the council's complaint resolution system was genuinely not designed to handle quickly. The bureaucratic delay alone could be significant. I stared at the message. Humans had known about the existence of the Galactic Council for 19 hours. They were already looking for procedural angles, and I made entry 1202 in my exceptions file. Wrote 1 word in, it, which remarkable. Then, I helped Dr. Nwosu's team draft the most technically accurate formal complaint in council submission history, filed on behalf of a species that didn't exist in the council's records yet, which would itself create a processing problem, because the council's intake system had no category for complaints from unregistered civilizations, and systems without categories don't process quickly. At hour 22, the Vethary repositioned again. I moved my pod, and for the first time since this had started, I thought that maybe 30 hours wasn't the end of the options. It was the beginning of them. Hour 26. The council's complaint intake system had been running for 31 years before I joined the ethnographic division, and in that time, it had processed approximately 44,000 individual submissions from registered member civilizations, non-member observers, and affiliated research institutions. It had been updated twice. Both updates had, according to the internal documentation, improved processing efficiency by a combined total of 11%. It had never received a complaint filed by a civilization it didn't have a registration record for. Not because this was explicitly against the rules. Nobody had ever thought to make a rule about it, because nobody had anticipated that a newly contacted stage for species would file a formal complaint within 19 hours of first contact, before they had even agreed to initiate the formal registration process, before they had been briefed on council procedure, before they had done anything except receive information, and immediately begin looking for ways to use it. The system flagged the submission as an error, sent it to a human, in the council sense of the word, meaning a council staff member, not an Earth person, for manual review. That staff member sent it to their supervisor. Their supervisor sent it to the office that handled registration anomalies. That office sent it back to the intake system with a note saying the complaint couldn't be processed until registration was complete. The intake system sent an automated acknowledgement to the filing party, Dr. Nwosu's team, and began the standard 60-day registration questionnaire process. The automated acknowledgement also, because this was the correct procedure for any complaint, that touched on an active Article 7 or 12 situation, sent a notification flag to the council's conflict management office. The conflict management office had 3 staff members on overnight rotation. 2 of them were handling an existing dispute between the Vreth Combine and the Sul Collective that had been running for 4 years. The third one, a junior analyst named Cyril Veth, who was 22 years in her career and who I'd met once at a council all-staff gathering 6 years prior, received the notification flag, read the associated file, and did something that I deeply respect. She called her supervisor at home. I know all of this because Cyril Veth told me afterward. I am getting ahead of myself. I'll return to the sequence. At hour 26, I didn't know any of what was happening inside the council's administrative structure. What I knew was that the Vethary had repositioned 4 more times in the last 4 hours, that I'd matched each repositioning, and that my pod's propulsion system was beginning to show efficiency degradation from the repeated short burn maneuvering. The kind of degradation that, if it continued at the same rate, would become a practical problem somewhere around hour 38. I told Dr. Nwosu, this. She said, How much does it matter? I said. If the propulsion drops below 60% efficiency, I lose the ability to match their repositioning speed. They'll be able to get a clean survey angle before I can close the gap. She said, like, what's it at now? I said, 73. She said, okay, what else can we do while we still have time? This was the thing about DR, which Nwosu that I kept coming back to then and in all the time since. She actually never spent a moment on what was going wrong, only on what was still available. I had a 31-year career's worth of training in systematic analysis, which is a sophisticated way of saying I was very good at understanding all the ways a situation could deteriorate. She had basically, I didn't know yet what she had exactly, but whatever it was, it moved in the opposite direction from deterioration. I said, I could try to make the Vethry survey less useful even if they get a clean angle. Honestly, she said, how? I said, their primary sensor sweep is mapping mineral concentrations by reading the planet's subsurface density variations. If there were significant electromagnetic interference in the specific frequency bands they use, the data would be corrupted. They would need to run the sweep again, which would add time. There was a silence, and then she said, what creates that kind of interference? I listed 3 things. The third one was coordinated, high-powered radar bursts across multiple ground stations on a rotating frequency pattern that mimics solar interference. A longer silence, which then, Beatrice, Colonel Osei had been on the same channel, listening. She said, I heard it, and 12 minutes later, Dr. Nwosu told me that 6 military radar installations across 3 continents were being repurposed. 11 minutes after that, the Vethry ship's survey sensors would have picked up what looked to their automated systems like a localized but significant solar electromagnetic event. I don't know if it worked. I wasn't running the right sensors to measure their data quality. But the Vethry ship went still for 40 minutes after the radar burst began. No repositioning. No communication. Just stillness. 40 minutes isn't a long time. Humans used those 40 minutes in a way that I find, even now, very difficult to explain to non-human audiences without sounding like I am exaggerating. You know, Dr. Nwosu's team had been working for 26 hours by this point. They had been running on what I'd later learn was a combination of coffee, a human stimulant with real, but inconsistent effects, and something harder to name, something that I've come to call, for lack of a better term, the decision to continue. It isn't adrenaline, though adrenaline is present. It isn't desperation, though the situation was genuinely desperate. It is a specific quality of attention that humans produce when they've decided that the alternative to continuing is unacceptable, and which makes them, in my observation, measurably more capable than they are under normal conditions. In those 40 minutes, they did 3 things. First, Dr. Nwosu's team completed the first draft of what would become Earth's formal council registration application. It wasn't procedurally perfect. It couldn't be without knowledge of council forms, which I've been feeding them as fast as I could translate them from official council language into English. But it was coherent, thorough, and it included a section which Iden T suggested and which wasn't in any council template I'd ever seen, titled Statement of Values and Planetary Intent. It was 2 pages. It described what Earth considered to be the principles that govern how they believed interstellar engagement should work. It was idealistic in places. It didn't pretend otherwise, which second. Colonel Osei had been making calls throughout those 26 hours, and at hour 26, those calls produced a result. A small number of countries had, operating under a coordination framework that Osei had apparently constructed from existing military alliance agreements, in a way that they're to be fair, lawyers were going to spend a long time reviewing, agreed to a joint statement that would be transmitted on the same frequency as the council-bound complaint. The statement was addressed to the Vethry specifically. It said, in language that was diplomatic on the surface and extremely clear underneath, we are aware of your presence. We are aware of your intentions. We sort of are in communication with the Council of Interstellar Peoples. We ask that, look, you hold your current position. We asked this once. Plus, the Vethry had no reason to take that statement seriously. Earth had no space force, no weapons that could reach them, no standing in any interstellar legal body. The statement was by every practical metric without teeth. The Vethry commander responded to it anyway. Plus, the response said, and the translation matrix worked on this one for a moment before resolving it. You are aware of nothing. You have been told a story. It was the first time the Vethri had communicated directly with Earth. Dr. Nwosu read well the response, which then she said, Vethkaran, is there anything in the Vethri's history with the council that they aren't proud of? I knew immediately what she was asking, and I knew the answer. 7 years ago, the Vethri had conducted an extraction operation on a world called Shirath 4. Shirath 4 had a, for what it's worth, pre-spaceflight indigenous population. The Vethri's pre-extraction survey had deliberately misclassified the population's development stage to avoid triggering the Council's protected world designation protocols. The misclassification had been discovered afterward. There, I think, had been a proceeding. The Vethri had paid a fine. The Council had accepted the fine, and the population of Shirath 4 was no longer there to have opinions about the settlement. This was in the public record. The Council published all preceding outcomes. I told Dr. Nwosu about it. She said all of it. Plus, I said all of it. The third thing that happened in those 40 minutes. Nwosu's team composed a second transmission. Not to the Council this time. Directly to the Vethri commander. It referenced the, in my opinion, Shirath 4 proceeding by its Council case number. It named the misclassification. It noted that Earth's communication with the Council was now documented and time-stamped. It said, and this was the sentence that I read 4 times before understanding what. It was doing, we know the difference between being told a story and being given information. We have been given information. We are giving you information now. I guess, Council knows we exist. Anything that happens to us is on the record. The Vethri went still again, not 40 minutes this time. 2 hours and 17 minutes. In that silence, Cyril Veth, the junior council analyst who had called her supervisor at home, had reached her supervisor, who had called their supervisor, who had convened an emergency subsession of the Conflict Management Review Board, which met for 45 minutes before issuing a formal advisory notice to the Vethri survey vessel. Cease survey operations pending conflict review. Noncompliance will trigger Article 12 escalation proceedings. Not a demand. An advisory notice, which the Council doesn't move quickly. But it had moved. The Vethri commander's response to the Council's advisory notice was logged, transmitted, and received at my pod's communication array at hour 29. The Vethri TBH ship was withdrawing. Not permanently, which the commander's message made clear that this was a temporary cessation pending legal review, that they were reserving all rights under the resource accords, that they considered the observer's interference a continuing violation, and that they be filing an expanded complaint upon return to their home system. They were also, measurably, moving away from Earth's moon at standard departure velocity. I sat in my pod. I looked at the empty space where the Vethri ship had been. I looked at the planet below me. My propulsion efficiency was at 61%. My personal log was open. I'd made 43 new entries in the last 29 hours. 43 entries in a log that had only had 17 entries in the previous 29 days. I typed, they're leaving, which Dr. Nwosu, on the open channel, said, we know. We're watching. I said, this isn't over. The Vethri will come back. The legal process will take time. Earth's registration with the Council will take time. There are other species that might look at this system. The survey data they collected, even degraded, exists somewhere in their systems. She said, I know. Amin said, what you did in the last 29 hours, it was extraordinary. But it was a delay, not a resolution. The Council moves slowly. Earth isn't protected yet. Not formally. She said, I know that too, and a silence. Then she said, Vethkaran, can I ask you something? I said yes. She said, why did you move your pod between us and them? You didn't have to. It wasn't sort of in your mandate. It put you in real jeopardy. You could have just filed the alert and waited. I didn't answer immediately. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer involved 29 days of data, 1,200 exceptions entries, a man in a trench with a dog, a woman in Lagos who was angry and still offered food, old people walking in a park so someone wouldn't entice. The honest answer was that I'd spent 31 years watching civilizations as patterns and problems and threat assessments, and then I'd watch humans for 29 days, and something in me had stopped being able to do that. Something in me, I guess, had started, and I didn't have good language for this, caring. What I said, because I'd learned from the humans I was talking to that sometimes the honest answer and the short answer are the same answer, was because I've been watching you for 29 days, and I didn't want to watch from distance anymore. TBH, another silence. Dr. Nwosu said, "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to us." I said, "I doubt that." She said, "You'd be surprised. My propulsion was at 61%. The Vethri ship was gone. The planet below me was continuing to do what it always did, rotating steadily, producing an incomprehensible volume of electromagnetic noise as billions of humans went about their days with no knowledge of what had happened above them in the dark." I started writing the official incident report. I wrote, Day 29. First contact initiated under exigent circumstances. Emergency Council alert filed. Vethri extraction survey interrupted via positional interference and procedural escalation. Council advisory notice issued. Vethri withdrawal confirmed as of 0347 hours local time. Then I stopped basically and I sat with the report for a moment. Then I opened my personal log and wrote something I'd never written in any personal log in 31 years of observer work. I don't want to leave. I looked at that sentence for a long time. Then I kept writing the official report because the official report was what the council needed, and what the council needed was still, for now, what I was responsible for. But the personal log stayed open. It always stayed open now. The council called me. Home 14 days after the Vethri withdrew. Not a request. A formal recall notice issued through the standard administrative channel, addressed to my observer registration number rather than my name, which is the pretty much council's way of telling you that what's happening is procedural, not personal, and that the distinction between those two things is one you're expected to maintain. I've been expecting it. The moment I moved my pod between the Vethri ship and Earth, I'd known this was coming. The recall, the review, the formal assessment of my conduct. Observers who deviate from mandate don't get disciplinary proceedings the way other council employees do. They get something quieter and more final. They get reassigned to basically a desk and to archival work, to the kind of institutional role that uses the word advisory in the title. Means you're here and you'll be consulted and nothing you say will change anything. I'd known this. I moved my TBH pod anyway. The 14 days between the Vethri's withdrawal and the recall notice were the most documented period of my career. Not by the official recording systems. Those have been running passively since day one, as they always did. By me. Personal log, which 4, sometimes 5 entries a day. The volume of material I produced in those 14 days exceeded every personal log I'd kept in the previous 31 years combined. And this is a fact I find both embarrassing and completely accurate. I was watching Earth differently by then, not sort of from 11,000 kilometers, which not from 400. I'd moved my honestly pod to approximately 160 kilometers above the surface, which is at the low edge of what humans call low Earth orbit, and which their monitoring systems were technically capable of detecting if they were looking in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. I wasn't invisible. I was simply unlikely to be noticed by anyone who wasn't specifically looking. DR, which Nwosu's team knew exactly where I was. Shiluk had asked on the second day after the Vethri left. I told her. She had said, "Good. I like knowing where you're." I made an entry about that. Those 14 days are when I began to understand something that I'd been circling around since day 4, when I watched a man hold a dog in a war zone. Something that my observer framework didn't have a category for, and that I've been filing under behavioral exceptions because I needed it somewhere, even if somewhere was wrong. The thing I've been circling around was this. Humans aren't irrational. That was what I'd been thinking for 29 days before the Vethri arrived. That the behaviors which didn't fit my framework were irrational, departures from the expected logic of a stage for civilization. Interesting, worth noting, but ultimately anomalous. I'd been wrong. Plus, the behaviors weren't departures from a logic. They were expressions of a different one, and humans operate from a logic that the Council's framework doesn't measure, because the Council's framework was built by species that consolidated their survival strategies around resource control and threat minimization. And while humans do both of those things, do them with genuine competence, as the Vethri had now experienced, they also do something else. Something prior to strategy. Something underneath it. They decide who counts. Not in the transactional sense. Not who is useful, who is an ally, who represents positive expected value. In a different sense. A broader one. They make a determination continuously about the circle of beings whose existence they're willing to treat as mattering to them. And the way, in my opinion, humans make that determination is strange and inconsistent, and sometimes produces outcomes that look irrational from outside and are from inside the most rational thing in the world. The woman in Lagos who was angry and still offered food had decided that the man she was angry with counted. The rescue teams who worked 40 hours for a stranger had decided a stranger counted. The old people walking in the park had decided that each other's presence counted enough to structure their week around. Look, in DR, Nwosu, who had spent 20 years listening for a signal that most of her colleagues had long since privately stopped believing would come, had received that signal in the middle of the night and responded in 4 words. We hear you. Go. Because she had, somewhere in those 20 years, decided that whatever was out there counted. Before she knew what it was. That is the thing I couldn't find a category for. That is the thing I kept filing under exceptions. It wasn't an exception. It was the whole engine. On day 7 of those 14 days, DR, Nwosu asked me if I'd be willing to do something that was going to make my situation with the council considerably more complicated. She asked if I'd be willing to speak to a broader audience. Not governments. To be fair, not military leadership. Not the scientific community, which had already been briefed and was, by all accounts, in a state of productive, organized chaos. She meant regular people. In my opinion, citizens. The humans who were going to find out what had happened. And they were going to find out, she said, because secrets of this scale don't stay secrets. And she would rather they found out in a way that came from somewhere honest than in a way that came from somewhere managing them. She said, I want them to hear it from you. Not a summary. Not a translation. Which you. As directly as we can manage. Plus, I said, I am an observer. I am supposed to be invisible. She said, you stopped being an observer when you moved your pod. That was true. I'd stopped being an observer in the functional sense somewhere around hour 1 of the Vethry standoff. The recall notice had confirmed it administratively, but it had happened before the paperwork. I said, what would you want me to tell them? She said, what you told me. What you saw. Why you didn't leave. I thought about it for a long time. About the review waiting for me at the council. About the procedural weight of what she was asking. A council observer giving a public address to an unregistered species, creating a documented precedent that the council's legal office was going to have feelings about. I thought about the man and the dog named Pebble. I thought about the wall laughed, which I thought about 44 hours of rescue workers who didn't know the stranger they were pulling from the rubble. I said, yes. Honestly, I'll do it. The address was transmitted 3 days later, which Dr. Nwosu's team and the coordinating governments had worked out a distribution method that reached what their analysts estimated was approximately 2 billion people across every major language group. My translation matrix handled the language side. What I had to handle was everything else. I wrote and rewrote the address 11 times. The 11th look version was the one I kept, and it was the shortest. I have included the relevant section here because the council's review board asked for it. And because I think it is the truest thing I've said in my career, I was sent to your world to observe and assess. This is a job I have done for 31 years. In that time, I have watched 41 civilizations develop the capacity to reach the stars. I have watched most of them treat that capacity as a tool of expansion, as a way to acquire more, to dominate more, to control more. This isn't a judgment, and it is a pattern. Patterns are what observers look for. Your species doesn't fit the pattern. Not because you don't fight. You fight actually constantly, and sometimes terribly, and the record of that, fighting is long and ugly and real. I'm not here to pretend otherwise, but fighting isn't what makes a civilization what it is. What makes a civilization what it is what it does in the space between the fighting. What it decides to care about when caring costs something. What it chooses to notice, and who it decides counts. I watched you for 29 days before the crisis came. In those 29 days, I saw you spend your limited resources on strangers. I saw you walk slowly through parks with people you barely knew so that they'd feel less alone. I saw you make art that had no economic purpose, just because you needed more in the world than what you could already see. I saw you decide, again and again in small ways and large ones, that the person next to you mattered. When the crisis came, you did in 19 hours what most civilizations take generations to learn. You coordinated across old divisions. You shared information instead of hoarding it. Plus, you thought about what was still possible rather than what had already gone wrong. And you filed a formal legal complaint with an interstellar bureaucracy you had known existed for less than a day, which is either the most pragmatic thing I've ever seen or the most audacious, and I suspect it is both. I kind of moved my vessel between you and the threat because I've been watching you for 29 days. 31 years of, I guess, training told me to file the report and maintain distance. 29 days of watching you told me something different. I listened, in my opinion, to the 29 days, which I am not able to tell you that you're safe. You aren't, not yet. The galaxy is old and complicated and not organized around anyone's well-being, including yours. The work ahead of you, the negotiation, the registration, the slow and frustrating process of being recognized by institutions that weren't built with you in mind, is real, and it is hard, and it will take longer than you want it to. But I can sort of tell you what I know. I have seen 41 civilizations reach this threshold. I have never, before now, sent an emergency alert to the Council asking them to protect one of them. That isn't nothing, and you are remarkable. I didn't know that was a thing I was allowed to say in an observer report. I am saying it now, because I'm not sure how much longer I'll be writing observer reports, and I'd rather say it than not. My name is Vethkaran. I have been watching you. I am glad I stayed close enough to see. The response to the address wasn't something I'd adequately prepared for. 2 billion people is a number. It is a large number. It isn't, in the emotional sense, a comprehensible number until those people begin, in their various ways, responding. The messages came through the same frequency DR. Nwosu's team had set up for our initial contact. They flooded Look It within hours. Most of them were in languages I had to run through the matrix. All of them. I read every one that I could in the time remaining. Before I had to leave, all of them were some version of the same thing. We hear you. Plus, thank you for not leaving. We didn't know anyone was watching. Plus, we're glad it was you. When I mean message from a child, Dr. Nwosu told me this because the sender's age was included in the metadata. Asked, do you have a dog? You sound like you'd like dogs. I made an entry in my personal log about that one. I still have it, and I read it sometimes. I left Earth's orbit on the 7th day after the address. The recall wasn't optional, and I'd already stretched it further than the Council would forgive easily. My propulsion efficiency had recovered to 78% with a rest interval. The pod was ready, and I wasn't, but I went anyway. The review board convened 6 weeks after my return. 5 senior council members, and my full observation record, the incident report, and the personal logs, which I submitted voluntarily because it seemed dishonest not to, and which the review board wasn't sure what to do with because personal logs are technically private and also technically inadmissible, but also in this case the clearest evidence of my reasoning that existed. They asked me many questions. The session lasted 11 hours. Most of, to be fair, the questions were about procedure. Had I understood the mandate? Had I understood the implications of first contact? Had I understood what blocking a Vethri survey meant legally? Had I understood the risks to myself, to the Council's relationship with the Vethri, to the complex and politically sensitive set of relationships that make up the interstellar community? I said yes to all of them. I understood all of it, and they asked me, then why? I said, because after 29 days of observation, the risk of watching from a distance had become a worse option than the risk of acting. The senior board member, an individual named Orith Sell who had been on the review board for 40 years and who I'd never spoken to personally before that day, looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, walk me through the 29 days. I walked her through the 29 days. All of it. The man with the dog, the woman in Lagos, plus the old people in the park, the rescue workers, the sand artist, Dr. Amin Nwosu's 4 words, Colonel Osei walking into a conference room and saying, we have a problem. Everyone sit down. The complaint filed in 19 hours. The radar bursts. The Shirath 4-case number dropped into a transmission like a precision instrument. The address. The messages. The child who asked about the dog. I talked for 3 hours. The review board didn't interrupt, which when I finished, Orith Sell was quiet for a long time. Then, for what it's worth, she said, in 40 years on this board, I have reviewed the conduct of 63 observers who deviated from mandate. In each of those 63 cases, the deviation was the result of a failure of judgment, insufficient distance, emotional compromise, poor analysis. She paused. This is the 64th case. I'm not certain it belongs in the same category. The board deliberated for 4 days. Their finding: a formal censure for unilateral first contact initiation, which would be entered into my record. A suspension of observer field privileges pending a 12-month administrative review. A requirement that I serve as primary counsel liaison for Earth's registration process, which was classified as a conflict of interest, but also as the most practical assignment given the circumstances. A note in the finding proposed by Orth Cell and approved by 3 of the 4 other board members that said, the observer's deviation, while procedurally improper, produced outcomes of net positive value to the council's mission and to the safety of a species that is highlight unusual promise. That to be fair, board notes this without prejudice, and I read that note 4 times in the corridor outside the chamber. Unusual promise. In council to be fair, language that is approximately the highest possible compliment. It is language designed to not sound like a compliment, because the council doesn't, as a rule, speak in ways that express enthusiasm. But I'd read enough council documents by then to know what it meant underneath the careful, qualified, institutional phrasing. It meant, we haven't seen this before, which we want to see what comes next. I began the liaison work the following week. 14 months of it. As it turned out, the 12-month review stretched because Earth's registration process was genuinely complicated, and because the humans involved in it were consistently more creative about the complications than the process was designed to handle, and because every time I thought I'd seen every possible way they could find a new angle on an old problem, they found one more. Dr. Nwosu led the Earth delegation for the first 8 months until her government changed, and the politics of who led the delegation changed with it. Colonel Osei was present, in one capacity or another, for most of the process. New people appeared. Diplomats, scientists, legal scholars who had spent a year becoming the world's fastest experts on interstellar law. A woman named Tariku Haile, a legal scholar from Ethiopia, found what she described as a procedural pathway in the Council's registration accords that would allow Earth to apply for provisional protected status while the full registration was still pending. For what it's worth, she was right. It worked. The Vethary's lawyers complained about it. The Council's procedural office accepted it. I made an entry in my personal log that day that said, Tariku Haile found a door in a wall nobody else saw. This is an honestly recurring pattern, and I no longer expect it to stop. Earth received provisional protected status 14 months after first contact. The formal registration vote is scheduled. It will pass. I'm not supposed to say that. The vote is technically unresolved, but I have attended 9 of the 12 scheduled pre-vote sessions, and I know how to read a council chamber, and the chamber has already made up its mind. What remains is the process of the process, which isn't nothing, but is also not what's actually happening underneath it. What is actually happening underneath? It is that 41 species of varying temperaments, politics, and self-interest have spent 14 months watching Earth navigate an impossible situation with ingenuity and stubbornness and the specific quality of attention that humans produce when they've decided that the alternative is unacceptable. And some of those species, not all, not even most, but enough, have started making entries in their own equivalent of my personal log, filing things under their own version of behavioral exceptions, wondering what those exceptions mean, and the Vethary filed 3 more complaints against me in the 14 months. All 3 were resolved. The third one, filed on grounds of continued conflict of interest related to my liaison role, was dismissed by Orth Cell personally with a 1-line response. That said, the conflict of interest was created by the observer's decision to protect a species worth protecting. The board declines to penalize an accurate judgment. I have that response printed. It is physical, which is unusual for me. I am not a being who collects physical objects, but that one I printed. My formal observer certification was reinstated 11 months into the liaison period, with the restriction that my next field assignment must be reviewed and approved by 2 senior council members rather than the standard one. Orth Cell volunteered to be one of them. She has sent told me why. I haven't asked. Some things are better as the fact of them rather than the explanation. I wrote the final version of my official Earth observation report, the one I'd been working on in fragments. revisions since day, honestly, 17 of the original assignment, and submitted it 4 days ago. It runs to considerably more pages than the standard observer report format specifies. The Council's administrative office sent me a note asking if I intended to submit an abbreviated version. I said no, which the report opens with the standard boilerplate: mission parameters, assignment duration, observation methodology, threat assessment framework. Look, all correct, all in the right format. The threat assessment section, which is the section the Council reads most carefully, contains one line that isn't in the standard format. It says, Earth look represents no threat to any civilization that doesn't first threaten it. The threat Earth represents to the Galactic Council's existing categories is a different matter. Pretty much, they don't fit. Recommend updating the categories. Plus, no one has responded to that recommendation yet. I expect the response will take some time. My personal log currently has 2,417 entries. I'll add one more before I close this document. It says, I think I was dispatched to watch humans fight. I watched them fight. I watched them stop fighting long enough to do something harder than fighting, to think, to adapt, to reach past every reason to give up. I watched them, to be fair, name dogs in trenches and offer food to people they were angry with, and walk slowly through parks so that their friends would know someone noticed. I watched them file a complaint with an interstellar council they had known existed for 19 hours and make it stick. I didn't want to leave. I still don't. I am writing this from a council administrative office on the central station, where it is very quiet and the light is even and nothing unexpected ever happens. Earth is, I think, 412 light years away. It feels closer than that, which it always will.